A desperate voice pierces through the night, frantic, breathless, pleading for help. She's dead. She shot herself. The call crackles over the line, but something isn't right. The panic sounds, practiced. Deputy Miranda Thomas pulls into the driveway, her heart pounding. The front door swings open. A man stumbles out, screaming, sobbing, but where are the tears? Inside, steam lingers in the air. A bathtub, still full. A body submerged. A gun at the bottom. A crime scene, or a cover-up? This wasn't just a tragic end. This was a story of control, deception, and a murder staged to fool the world, except for one fatal mistake. Kendy Howard was found in the bathtub, her body still, the water murky. A single gunshot wound to the head, an apparent suicide. But something was wrong. The gun, her own pistol, lay beneath the water. No suicide note. No clear motive. Just silence. Deputy Miranda Thomas scans the room. Broken glass on the floor. Clothes tossed carelessly across the bedroom. Wet towels piled behind the door. And in the laundry room, the dryer hums, still running. Fresh, clean towels tumbling inside. But why? Then there was Dan Howard, her husband of 26 years. A man trained in law enforcement. A man who knew how to control a crime scene. He cried. He wailed. But not once did a single tear fall. For investigators, one question loomed large: did Kendy take her own life, or was this a carefully staged execution? Kendy Howard was the kind of woman people gravitated toward. She was full of energy, always up for an adventure, always ready to make someone laugh. Friends described her as fun-loving, kind, and full of life. She had a deep love for the outdoors, whether it was riding horses as a child, spending time at the lake, or hitting the gym. She embraced life with open arms. But behind the smiles, there were cracks. Cracks that grew deeper with each passing year. Her marriage to Dan Howard had lasted 26 years. To the outside world, they seemed like a strong couple. Respected in their small Idaho town, financially successful, even affectionate in public. But those closest to Kendy saw the truth. She wasn't happy. Not anymore. Dan was a man who demanded control. Over the years, Kendy confided in friends that her husband dictated everything: how they spent their money, how their household was run, even where she went. He kept a tight grip on their finances, refusing to let her have any financial independence. When she tried to enjoy life, spending money on herself, traveling, or even small indulgences, Dan would push back. It was a constant source of tension. Then came the turning point. In 2011, Dan Howard, then a state trooper, pulled the trigger during a traffic stop, killing a woman. He was cleared of any wrongdoing, but the event marked a shift. The once confident law enforcement officer became distant, withdrawn. Those around him noticed a change, one that only grew worse over time. Kendy felt it more than anyone. She saw his temper flare more often. He became unpredictable. The man she had married, the one she once felt safe with, was now someone she feared. The arguments became more frequent, their connection all but gone. And then, she made a decision. She was leaving. She wanted out of the marriage, out of the control, out of Dan's shadow. She had met with a divorce lawyer. She was actively looking for a home of her own. Her friends saw a spark in her again, a woman reclaiming her life. But leaving someone like Dan Howard was never going to be easy. And Kendy had no idea just how dangerous it would be. From the moment detectives arrived, something felt off. The scene looked like a suicide, but did it feel like one? Kendy Howard had been found in the bathtub, a single gunshot wound to the back of her mouth. A method of suicide so rare, it immediately raised suspicions. Most self-inflicted gunshot wounds to the head follow a predictable trajectory, either through the temple or under the chin. The angle of the bullet, traveling downward, didn't align with typical suicides. It was strange. Too strange to ignore. Then there was Dan Howard. The grieving husband. The former police officer who knew exactly how investigations worked. He sobbed, gasped for breath, and hunched over in apparent devastation. But when it came time to test his hands for gunshot residue, he hesitated. He stuffed his hands into his coat pockets. He fidgeted. He wiped them repeatedly. And when detectives finally swabbed him, nothing. No trace of gunpowder. Almost as if he had expected the test and taken precautions. The medical examiner had doubts of his own. If Kendy had fired a gun inside the tub, the water should have been dark with blood. But it wasn't. There were no splatters on the walls, no evidence of close-range discharge on her body. And then, the most glaring omission, there was no suicide note. Kendy was planning for the future, looking forward to her new life. If she had been in distress, where was the message to her family? Where was the explanation? As detectives dug deeper, the case took a chilling turn. The autopsy revealed what the water had concealed. Kendy had more than just a gunshot wound. Her body was covered in bruises, fresh, deep, violent. Her wrists. Her arms. Her torso. And then, the detail that changed everything. Her jaw had been broken. This wasn't a woman who calmly stepped into a warm bath, lifted a gun, and pulled the trigger. This was a woman who had fought. A woman who had been beaten. A woman who had suffered long before the gun was ever fired. Detectives now had a different question to answer. Not whether Kendy had killed herself, but whether she had already been dead before the gun was ever fired. As detectives pieced together the final days of Kendy Howard's life, a disturbing pattern emerged. She wasn't just leaving Dan, she was escaping him. For years, Kendy had endured his control, his outbursts, his suffocating grip on their finances. But in the weeks leading up to her death, she had taken her first real steps toward freedom. She had found a new home. She had spoken with a divorce attorney. She had even told friends that she no longer loved Dan. And Dan knew it. Witnesses recalled Kendy's growing unease. She had confided in friends that she was afraid. She sent photos of bruises, evidence of Dan's temper. She even told her mother that she felt she didn't deserve to be here anymore. But no one, not even Kendy herself, could have imagined what would happen next. On the night of her death, something had set Dan off. Investigators would later learn that just hours before Kendy was found in the bathtub, she had confronted Dan about their finances. She had told him she was done. That she was leaving for good. That the life he controlled for decades was about to slip away. And then, silence. But the evidence told a different story. The bruises. The broken jaw. The packed duffel bag in the bedroom, as if someone had been planning to leave. The clean towels in the dryer, spinning just moments before the 911 call. Each detail pointed to something far more sinister. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a crime of control. A crime of power. A crime committed by a man who thought he was smarter than everyone else. A man who knew how to manipulate a crime scene. A man who believed he could make a murder look like a suicide. But what Dan Howard didn't know, was that detectives weren't buying it. Detectives now had a working theory: Kendy Howard didn't die by suicide. She was murdered. And her killer had tried to cover it up. But proving it? That would be another challenge entirely. Dan Howard was no ordinary suspect. He was a former Idaho state trooper. He knew how investigations worked. He knew what detectives looked for. And more importantly, he knew how to manipulate a crime scene. But even the smartest criminals make mistakes. And Dan had made plenty. First, there was the gunshot. Forensics experts determined that Kendy's gunshot wound wasn't just unusual, it was almost impossible for a self-inflicted wound. The angle of the bullet was all wrong. Instead of traveling straight back or slightly upward, it took a downward trajectory, lodging in her vertebrae. That meant someone else had been holding the gun. Then, there was the blood, or rather, the lack of it. Kendy had suffered a fatal gunshot wound, but the water in the tub wasn't dark with blood, as it should have been. That suggested she had already been dead before the shot was fired. But the most damning piece of evidence? The autopsy. Kendy's body told a brutal story, one that Dan Howard hadn't planned for. Her jaw had been broken. Her arms, her torso, her legs, covered in bruises. These weren't the marks of a woman preparing to take her own life. They were the marks of a woman who had fought for it. And lost. Then came the final piece of the puzzle, the timing of the dryer. Detectives had noticed the machine running when they arrived. When they pulled the manufacturer's cycle data, the pieces clicked into place. The dryer had been started within minutes of Dan's 911 call. He had washed away the evidence. Or so he thought. One by one, the carefully placed elements of Dan Howard's crime scene were falling apart. His alibi was slipping. His staged suicide was crumbling. And soon, the walls were about to close in. Dan Howard thought he had committed the perfect crime. He thought he had covered his tracks, staging the scene, cleaning up the evidence, and playing the role of the grieving husband. But what he didn't expect was that investigators were closing in. As detectives built their case, they turned to Kendy's loved ones, the people who knew her best. And what they heard shattered any remaining doubt. Her daughter, Brooke, was one of the first to speak out. When she got the call from Dan that her mother was dead, her reaction wasn't shock, it was rage. "You did this," she told him. "I know you did this." It was a rare moment in a murder case, where a family member didn't just suspect foul play, but openly accused the killer before an arrest was even made. Then came Kendy's friends. They spoke of the bruises she had tried to hide, the late-night calls where she expressed her fear, the moment she told them she no longer loved Dan and was finally ready to walk away. But most chilling of all, they remembered what Kendy had told them just days before she died. "If anything happens to me, it was Dan." With mounting witness testimony, forensic evidence, and a timeline that no longer made sense, prosecutors knew they had enough. It was time to bring Dan Howard in. In April 2023, more than 2 years after Kendy's death, Dan was arrested and charged with her murder. The man who once believed he was untouchable, the former law enforcement officer who thought he could stage the perfect crime, was now in handcuffs. But the case wasn't over yet. Dan still had one chance to escape justice, the trial. And as the courtroom filled with Kendy's friends, family, and the investigators who had spent years fighting for her, the truth was finally about to be revealed. The courtroom was silent as the prosecution laid out their case against Dan Howard. Piece by piece, the illusion of a grieving husband crumbled under the weight of the evidence. The gunshot wound, impossible for a self-inflicted shot. The bruises, a clear sign of a violent struggle. The broken jaw, proof that Kendy had suffered long before the gun was fired. The running dryer, an overlooked detail that exposed Dan's desperate attempt to clean up the crime scene. The missing gunshot residue, suggesting he had wiped his hands clean before investigators arrived. And then, the most damning testimony of all. Kendy's own words. The jury listened as friends and family recalled her final days, her excitement about a fresh start, her fear of Dan's reaction, her warning, "If anything happens to me, it was Dan." Dan Howard sat motionless as the prosecution delivered its final blow. The story he had crafted, the crime scene he had staged, the alibi he had rehearsed, it had all fallen apart. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. And when they returned, the verdict was swift. Guilty. Dan Howard, once a respected state trooper, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His years of training, his calculated planning, his attempt to deceive the world, it had all failed. Kendy Howard had fought for her life, but in the end, it was the truth that won the battle. Justice had finally been served. Dan Howard had been sentenced. The trial was over. But for those who loved Kendy, the story didn't end there. Her daughter, Brooke, would never hear her mother's laughter again. Her friends would never see her light up a room. The woman who had finally found the courage to leave, to reclaim her life, had it stolen in the most brutal way possible. But Kendy's story wasn't just one of tragedy. It was one of resilience, strength, and a fight for justice that refused to be silenced. Her case became a chilling reminder of the dangers of control, of coercion, of the unseen battles happening behind closed doors. It was a story of how law enforcement, when patient, methodical, and relentless, could bring the truth to light, even when a murderer thought he had covered every track. Kendy's friends and family now honor her memory, not just by remembering who she was, but by raising awareness. Domestic violence isn't always visible. It isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's the quiet warnings, the bruises hidden under sleeves, the whispered fears shared with trusted friends. Kendy tried to leave. And that made her a target. Her story serves as a warning, and as a call to action. For every woman who feels trapped. For every person afraid to take that final step toward freedom. Because sometimes, leaving isn't the end of the battle. It's only the beginning. Kendy Howard's story will never be forgotten. And for Dan Howard, now locked away for life, his story ends where it always should have, behind bars. Kendy Howard's case is a stark reminder that not all dangers come from the shadows. Sometimes, the greatest threats come from the ones closest to us. The people we trust. The ones we share a home with. The ones who promise to love us. Her murder wasn't random. It wasn't impulsive. It was the final act of a man who refused to lose control. A man who saw Kendy's freedom as his greatest threat. And in the end, it wasn't enough to silence her story. Her name lives on, not just in the memories of those who loved her, but in the lessons her case has taught the world. The signs of abuse. The red flags. The importance of listening when someone says they're afraid. If you or someone you know is in an abusive relationship, don't wait. Don't ignore the warning signs. And don't assume that just because someone seems strong, they're safe. Help is out there. Resources exist. And most importantly, you are not alone. Kendy's voice was taken from her. But her story? That will never be silenced. Thank you for watching. If you found this story important, consider subscribing to the channel for more true crime cases that deserve to be told. And remember, justice is only possible when the truth is brought to light.